was really pleased to receive one compliment the other day, yesterday, saying, and unfortunately, it's going to be a deception now, because the compliment was, oh, I'm so impressed by how well you manage the gender balance in all of your sessions. So this is the deception, okay? This session is gender unbalanced. On the other hand, we had this morning a session that was also gender unbalanced, but in the other direction. So hopefully this is not too uncompensated. So let me say the reason for this session. There are many representatives of the private sector in this room. This is actually a bit unusual for a conference that otherwise would be primarily academic. And on the other hand, I've been in many conferences, in particular in sustainable finance, that are mostly, or they're organized by practitioners, and there the presence of the academia is very scant, so almost nobody there. And that is reflected also sometimes in some of the expert committees that are then in charge of providing recommendations for policy making. So clearly there is, among the various gaps that this conference is trying to fill, it's not just the gap between sustainability and finance, but it's also the gap between academia and research. And so this is why we thought it was important to have a session during the day that is the central day, the Thursday, which has been mostly devoted to practitioner sessions, to have one session where you can have a discussion about what is research bringing on the table. And so for this, we have done a sort of, remaining in the bad metaphor of the gender, is a muscular demonstration because we have 6 very successful coordinators of European projects. And so we will hear from them actionable insights from research into policy for economics and in particular for sustainable finance. So I'd like to start by, the format will be the following. We're going to deep dive in one particular example, and we've taken the one that is closest in terms of, say, progress in the level of applicability and in the level of engagement of stakeholders, which is the Saymetric project. I'll say a few words in a second. And then, for which there will be some slides, and then the rest will be more of a panel discussion, reacting on those. So let me introduce the panelists with me today. So we start with Stan Dupré. He's the global CEO of 2 Degrees Investing, which is by now leading a very important think tank. It's an NGO. We've been shaping the discussion about climate finance in the last 4 years. We have Guido Caldarelli, who you met, you saw yesterday, a project coordinator of multiple EU project coordinator. In particular, he was the coordinator of the first project on systemic risk and networks. Then we have Giovanni Dosi, a pioneer in technical change and economic theory of technical change and implications for growth, currently coordinator of Easy Growth. Myself, coordinator of Dolphins project and also the Simple project, we finished just a few months ago. Then to my left, we have Filippo Addari, who has been involved in many European projects, currently in OpenMaker, which is about social manufacturing and social innovation. He's an expert in social innovation and knows the inner working of the EU policy. And then finally we have Professor Carlo Jäger, who you met already yesterday, and currently coordinator of the KUGS project. So let's start with Stan, you have 5 minutes for the first part, then we do the round of questions, and then we get to the second part.
Perfect. Thank you, Stefano. I must say I am very impressed by the organization of the conference and all your IT thing. That's amazing. Anyway, so I will just briefly introduce this SEI metric project. So the core objective of the project was to show that it is possible to assess the alignment or misalignment of an investment portfolios with climate goals. And so that's actually this project is a consortium led by 2° Investing Initiative, but involving various organizations, including the University of Zurich. So basically everything started when I used to work on the carbon footprint of companies and portfolios like 12 years ago. And we wanted to compare the results with climate targets and use that to inform financial risk analysis. And it turns out that it was a bit of a dead end because the metrics were backward-looking. They were aggregated usually at global level, so you cannot really compare that with a scenario or inform financial analysis, since the risks are very local usually. So to address this topic, we basically started with the IEA technology roadmap and tried to compare that with the deployment of technologies by the companies in the portfolios. So to do that, we were not able to use the reporting from companies, so we contracted with business intelligence data providers in different sectors, the key energy sector covered by the IEA scenario. And so basically that helped us to get data at plant level or oil field level on most energy-related assets in the world. You see here the number of assets we got per sector. And then the work we did was to match that with the owners of these assets, the securities issued by these companies, so stocks and bonds, then the funds that hold these bonds and stocks, and at the end of the day, the financial institutions that are invested in these funds. So it took about 3 years to produce that. And so the result is what you can see on the screen. We can compare for each technology the deployment of the technology by the companies in the portfolio with the market. And we can also compare what are the future plans of the companies, like here the example for renewables, with what they should do in a 2° scenario, in the 2° scenario of the IEA. So here you get the example for renewable and the comparison with the 2° target. And the kind of result is the gap between what should be done in the scenario and what is planned by the companies. We can compare that across with multiple scenarios. I showed this morning what we did in Switzerland for the pension funds and the insurers, and the comparison with different scenarios, 2°, 4°, 6° from the IEA. We can also compare investors and portfolio between each other. So here you get the example for the insurers in the US on renewables. And that's an important aspect. We can also provide indicators that help investor to engage with investee company. So here you have indicative targets, for instance, in terms of deployment of renewables. So that works for green technologies, but it also works for brown technologies. Here, coal power, for instance. And you have like this indicator is, for instance, what should be retired in terms of coal-fired power plant by the companies to meet the target. So that's for the results. It's applicable to various energy technologies, here power, car makers for the deployment of hybrids and electric vehicles. And basically the investor get the result for each technology in each region of the scenario. Basically, we covered only a small percentage of the stock market in terms of, we cover 100% of the sectors for a small percentage of the stock market, roughly 15%. that relate to the energy technology sector, but it covers about 90% of the emissions related to these to a portfolio. The output of this project are open source methodology, database, and software that you can find on the website of the project. We road tested the model on 200 investors, institutional investors, and they are mostly satisfied with the results, as you can show here. And we also use the results to, and I will finish with that, integrate this into financial regulation. And that was one of the strong, I would say, like advantage of having something open source, publicly available and publicly financed, is that you can turn it into a standard. So it has been integrated basically, it turned into a requirement by the French Article 173 that make this type of assessment mandatory in France. California is about to introduce something similar for public pension funds. We are discussing also this thing at the high-level expert group of the European Commission, and it's likely to be integrated in various pieces of European regulation. And you also see the task force from Bloomberg that is now recommended climate scenario analysis. So that's basically the output of this project. I will develop later on related projects that are building on this one, and we also manage.
Thank you very much, Stan. I'd like to turn now to Filippo Dari. So what we've seen from Stan, actually, if you can leave on this slide, not the next one, yeah, this one. So these are examples of recent developments, and there will be more. Actually, Stan is also a member of the high-level expert group on sustainable finance. So there's a number of developments that are happening at the EU level, and as you've seen this morning from the session on pension funds, also in Switzerland. I'd like now to turn to Filippo and ask to comment a little bit on what are the developments that you see in the backdrop, in particular regarding the so-called Juncker plan.
Okay.
And of course, what are the implications for the private sector that you see?
So, it's interesting because since yesterday we have been referring to Larry Fink's letter to the CEOs, calling for the CEOs of companies to take in consideration social goals in the strategy of their business. And so there is one point that, in my view, it's very important to make. This is not a personal moral call. Perhaps the guy doesn't really care at all. The context is changing. Therefore, CEOs have to adapt. And the context is changing because some government programs are changing the policy frameworks and the incentives. Now, Juncker launched in 2014 the Juncker plan for public and private investment for growth and employment. But we have seen this attention towards finance, and in particular how to leverage financial markets towards social goals quite before. I had actually the privilege to follow this, at least one of the strands. The British government already from 2000 put in place a set of policies in order to make the City of London a capital that's that kind of finance. And then in 2010 launched the Big Society Capital as the largest fund of funds. But it's part of a really market-making exercise that started in 2000, so with a completely different political context, and that the administration, the various administrations, carried forward despite the changes in government. The European Commission picked on that a bit later, but what we have seen from 2014 to these days is a dramatic change. And again, in my view, this is not, how could I say, as I call it, a moral call. There are some structural factors that are driving leaders in both in public and private sector to rethink fundamentally the strategy. I would name just a few, certainly the climate agenda, as well as globalization and the implication on job markets and industries, as well as, and this is the very interesting aspect, the social impact of new technologies. Uber is just one of a very long list. But there are also some specifically social trends which have become a concern for leaders. Aging society, migration, and ultimately the rise of populism. A combination of all of that, and we cannot get into the details, is really driving leaders to review their policies. So when the European Investment Bank put in place the Juncker plan, which has already been refreshed from 315 billions to half a trillion, and they're already working on Juncker Plan 3. It tells you that there are some dramatic changes happening in the policy framework.
You made it in perfect time, but I would like to borrow on the next slot of time. Could you elaborate on what it implies more precisely, this new environment of the Juncker plan in terms of thinking? You were mentioning yesterday to me system thinking, and so what kind of research does that imply to develop going forward?
So in 2014, when the text of the plan was published, there was a sign that turned our attention. For the first time in a document of the European Investment Bank, there was this societal impact as an investment indicator. That was really interesting. To be honest, the societal impact was just societal impact, nothing more. And when we tried to put some meat around this concept, the reality was that there was very little behind that. But that created that window that over the next years we have seen filling with, let's call them experiments. Previously, someone mentioned the social impact bonds. Last year, the European Investment Banks signed the first financing for social impact bonds to tackle the issue with migration and their integration in Finland. Last year signed also the first financing of an infrastructure project. I worked on that one, in which it was included the dimension of societal impact. What is interesting is, but let's play that is Chatham House, which is clearly not. There are a bit too many people. But let's play that is just between us. My impression is the problem is very clear. The solutions and the instruments to address it are not at all. So even in an institution like the European Investment Bank has got it that the societal dimension of financing has to be part of the strategy, has to be integrated in all their operations. How to do it? That's a big question mark. And so instead of putting up a policy or a plan, they are financing experiments. And this is where I see the potential convergence of practice and research. We don't have it's a bit like Cristoforo Colombo. We don't have the map to reach the continent, the Asian his mind. And actually, probably, we want to go in one direction. We know that we need to go there, but we don't really know about what we are going to face. So the only way is just to arm a ship and go.
And explore.
And explore.
And that's what research is all about. Let's move to Carlo. So we heard about, on the one hand, the environmental climate dimension, on the other hand, the social dimension, societal, or in a broader sense. So, question to you would be, so then, what does standard economic theory have to offer to understand and manage, in particular, the transition to low-carbon economy, and similarly, to include this social dimension into management of an allocation of capital?
I think you all have somewhere at school, on the internet, at university, wherever, seen the famous diagram of a supply curve and a demand curve and their intersection. What economics has to offer, and it's not an easy joke, is the power of this image. The image that the economy, both locally and globally, has an equilibrium that it can attain, and then comes a lot of argument, historical, theoretical, empirical, to the effect that this equilibrium is desirable, that it's good to be there. There are exceptions and things like that, but basically, and this was a huge effort over more than 100 years of scholars, not only from economics, but of course mainly from economics, we know a lot about properties of an equilibrium and the environment of the equilibrium. If you are close to it, but you are not exactly there, we can say a lot of things. This means, for example, for free trade, negotiations about Brexit, these kind of things, we know and we can calculate the effects of small changes of various taxes, tariffs, and things like that. Always in reference to an equilibrium that usually we don't know precisely, but we have some rough idea of. As long as this is the problem we are dealing with, I think we really have the tools to do so. The question is whether the problems that you raised are of this kind. Are we in a situation where there is a reasonably well equilibrium, we are close to it, and all we need to do is to nudge the system a few millimeters until it's really there? I really tried to be short, but I think it's useful to take the example of the financial crisis. The response to the financial crisis internationally, there are exceptions, especially in America, but broadly speaking, the response is small, detailed regulations of hundreds and hundreds of pages. Things like Basel III, Frank Dodd in America, the MiFID thing in Europe. These are all attempts to nudge the system a little bit without radically changing it. Not trying to envisage any major change of the financial system. This is also the frame of mind that you get from what we know so far in order to think about issues of sustainability. You asked what it has to offer, not where we go from here.
That will be the next. Thank you, Carlo. I'd like to turn to Giovanni, and I'm afraid we have to share the microphones. I'll pass it to you in a moment. So from what we've been hearing, and also from previous discussions, so we know there is a growing interest among policymakers and analysts in the business for alternative models, and in particular those that are able to account for characteristics that are not in the standard theory, such as the ability of agents to learn, the ability of agents to interact, and in particular to interact in an asymmetric way, which is an extension of the theory of markets with asymmetric information, for which Joe was awarded the Nobel Prize. So, question to Giovanni, who is an expert, is world famous for theory innovation, technical change. So why is that? Why is there is this growing interest? And in particular, since you've been coordinating the Easy Growth project, could you illustrate what this complementary approach have to offer in this respect?
Well, Easy Growth is a very ambitious project. It was and is still alive. A quite successful attempt to make a broad diagnostic of the state of European economy in the context of the world economy. Let me try from some element of this diagnostic. Well, first of all, and many people, especially non-economists, know it. Economists have more difficulty in understanding it. But the first major point is that markets are not self-regulating. Painfully, the crisis has reminded us that markets are not self-regulating. It applies to finance, but we have shown in our project also, for example, on labor markets. If you make them more too flexible, you make the economy more fragile. Second, if you want to cope with crisis, austerity is not the answer. On the contrary, it's part of the problem. It's self-defeating, as the European experience shows. What is the way out? Well, the way out is our massive Keynesian, innovation-friendly, environment-friendly policies. And this is where the current discussion comes in. How do innovation come about? Well, innovation come about embedded in an institutional context. It's not, I mean, a lot of people nowadays is infected by this market drunkenness, so that innovation arrive. Where do they arrive from? From Marx. Innovation arrive because they are generated. And they are generated, especially over the last 17 years, they are generated in universities, public institutions, and a good deal of public programs. This is what Mariana Mazzucato calls mission-oriented programs. My belief is that also on climate and sustainability, we need massive mission-oriented program addressing objectives. I mean, even if we don't know the map, and we don't know the map of where we want to go, we need to know where we want to go. And we cannot say, let the market decide where we want to go. And this is been shown in for example, the Apollo program. The Apollo program was, I want to go to the moon. And, paraphrasing Draghi, we do whatever it takes to go to the moon. It's not that let's ask the market if they want to go to the moon and how. We want to go to the moon, and we want to make profitable for private actors to produce pieces of engine, of the missile, of the to be able to experiment the device to go to the moon. This means a complete debunking of several myths. One myth is why the government should know better. Yes, the government knows better because, for example, the public decides that we are taking a very dangerous course in climate change. And you cannot allow the market decide where we should go, because perhaps when the market has decided it's too late and we have gone in the wrong direction. The Apollo program, for example, is an interesting example because it is a publicly directed program supported by private and public finance, patient one, in which you have made profitable for the private to do things that the public want them to do. And we should go back to this type of philosophy that is exactly the contrary to the market-friendly philosophy that you find often, especially in Europe.
Thank you, Giovanni. Let me ask maybe Filippo if you want to react, and in particular to expand on the question of whether we need to revisit or reinvent the relation between public and private, in particular in PPPs, public-private partnerships, since you have been, you're an expert of that.
I'm not an academic. I would define myself an entrepreneur, so I rather use narratives to describe situations. So I like to think, since Giovanni mentioned Marianna Mazzucato, the opposite of Marianna, so there is the Marianna thesis, the entrepreneur state, and then there is Michael Porter, the shared value. In my experience dealing with those public-private projects, I feel quite not aligned with none of them, meaning that there isn't the silver bullet. I wouldn't bank on the public institutions leading innovation, having a vision, having a popular mandate, more than certain companies. I rather think through at least I think there are, at least in my professional experience, other avenues that at least are as interesting to explore as the Porter and Mazzucato. Number one, that there was that interesting concept of Marco Olson and his idea of the private interest. He used that very inspiring image of the mafia boss who becomes so powerful to control the entire region. So the mafia boss has to move from his or her private interest into the interest of the community. So this dynamic that I've started seeing in some parts of the private sector, and it's not by chance that some private sector leaders have become so powerful that have started thinking about public goods, in particular global public goods. Not, as I said, because they are ethically driven, but because their position in society has changed. And it's certainly a question about democracy, because they are the new leaders in the world and nothing to do with public accountability. Still, there are vehicles like the Gates Foundation or Michael Bloomberg are certainly some of the leaders in terms of transformation, both in the public and the private sector, more than most of the political leaders. But there is also another dimension, which is somehow the opposite of that, and it was the one of Elinor Ostrom. So again, private action, but the private action of the community, not the big bosses, still funding, delivering, managing public goods. Both of them somehow don't fit into this Mazzucato versus Porter vision. And I think all these options should be explored. And as entrepreneurs, I would say also use those different strategies.
Want to have a quick reaction? We have an important question afterwards, which is about data infrastructure, but maybe...
Just with a sentence. I find difficult to imagine the Manhattan Project done with Roosevelt saying, who's going to come up with a bomb? If you come up with an interesting project of a bomb, I'll finance you via an Horizon 2020 project. I find it difficult to imagine that.
Thank you. So I'd like to move now to a more practical set of questions, which have to do with the need, or let's explore that, for data, in particular open data, that have, would become available to evaluate the sustainability of assets, and what would be the governance behind that would somehow provide the kind of credibility that we need in order to build a reliable taxonomy. Maybe you want to start, Stan, since you've been involved in this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So I think so I will just mention the example I presented before on this kind of physical asset level data and metrics for investor. I think on this, we faced two obstacles when we started to work on that. The first one was the lack of innovation in the private sector. So that relates to what you were describing before. So I'm not sure we have built an atomic bomb or a rocket to go to the moon. But basically what we've seen is that there were limited demand from asset owners just because they were basically outsourcing the research to the asset managers. The asset managers were interested to address the expectation, but it was not a core concern. I mean, an asset manager on the equity side, they turn their portfolio every 20 months on average, which means that climate risks are not really material for them on this horizon. And so it's mostly a question of communication. So usually they tend to outsource the research to ESG data provider and index provider, who basically do not invest in R&D if they don't have a kind of concrete short-term demand. And so what we've seen is that this is a kind of like a vicious cycle. And if you don't inject like some type of public money, you cannot break that. And so I think the scenario analysis have been basically brought thanks to public money on that. Then there's the question, to really integrate that into public policies, you need to have a standard. You need to have comparability. And what we've seen when we try to integrate that in the French regulatory framework is that there have been a kind of battle of all the asset managers, data providers to have like their own framework becoming the norm. And basically that prevented policy action from the government. And so I think it's important, and we are actually putting a lot of energy on that, to create databases and public and open source software that can then be endorsed by governments to create standard and mandatory disclosure frameworks, for instance.
And could you elaborate, would you envisage a sort of the European observatory or European data infrastructure for sustainable finance, the one that was mentioned at the end of the interim report of the high-level expert group?
So I don't tweet what I will say because the report is not published yet. But basically, the idea would be to have like a kind of body involving governments and probably also private institutions to kind of monitor the transition to a low-carbon economy across the European Union, purchasing data from the private sector, probably also having their own kind of database with at least a certain level of transparency on the data. I think basically they don't exactly know what will be their sources, but probably they will build on the project I mentioned before, partly. And so here on this, what we are trying to do in terms of model is basically to have like a database where you can use governments can use the results, like the Swiss government did with this project we were presenting this morning. The private sector can access the database as well. And if you want the very granular level of data, then you have to pay and have a kind of system where you have a mix of freemium model and some public-private partnership to develop the data, basically. So I don't know if it will be the model that will be adopted by the observatory. It's up to the European Commission. But that's clearly what we're putting in place with the support of the European Commission. and I think that will probably prevail on that on this topic.
Just as a note for those who have been following the conversation, this was it's not an official recommendation. Was a further note at the very end of the interim report, and many of us were hoping that it would remain part of the final report.
So yeah, I think it has been upgraded to business class in the report.
That's a breaking news. Excellent, thank you, Stan. Let's move to Guido. Would you like to comment on the importance of having data infrastructure that is funded by public and in particular European research?
Yes, of course. I have to say I share most of the view of Giovanni in the sense that I believe that research in particular must be, at least partly, but I mean must be funded by public. I mean this is why research proceeded so far. I believe this eliminates automatically most of the conflicts of interest in studying what we do. I'm a physicist, I have to say, so probably it's less sensitive now to market pressures, well, what we do. And no, not for me, for Giovanni, and the questions that are there. And in these recent times, what we are seeing, this revolution that, let me say, also partly originated by a group of physicists some time ago who invented the transistor, and originated by others who studied quantum mechanics, something that nobody apart Beer in Denmark would finance, research very, very narrow. I mean, in this revolution in which we are living, now there is a value creation by our everyday action. So by using Twitter, by using browsing, by using a system that is a series of services built on the internet, mostly based on the web, was invented, you see, physics comes back in CERN. And this value must, I mean, this is a justice, very elementary point of view, must be given back to the people who originated. This is my view. So in this respect, the importance of the structure that would ensure that this is definitely applied, that is done for the common good, I believe is pretty important. I don't know if this is something that answers the question you gave. That's okay, yeah.
So let's turn for a final reaction from Carlo.
I have a question to the audience. On Tuesday, the president of the Swiss Central Bank gave a talk, a public talk, here in Zurich. Who from this room was there? It's not the overwhelming majority, to be diplomatic, you know. We're discussing about sustainability and finance. He has to give this talk to justify himself in front of the Swiss people. It has to do with what Guido just said. I'm Swiss and I'm proud that we have these institutions. But I also understand, because I'm Swiss and we run a little gathering in Davos every year, that what is happening on this planet is much, much bigger than what any single nation, let alone Switzerland, can discuss. We have a global financial system. What is happening on this planet is, and it's a new development since a few decades, we are getting a global oligarchy. This is what's happening. We are helpless in the face of the global oligarchy, and the global oligarchy is helpless in the face of the problem they face. It's not a very good situation. Historically, there have been experiences with trying to fight against elites. Sometimes they went not badly, like in the US or in this little country. Sometimes they went terrible, like in Russia or other countries. People may have different views on this, but I see absolutely no way how a global insurrection would substitute the global oligarchy with some other wonderful thing that will then help us to solve our problems. This has implications for, what was the question? What can EU-funded research contribute to sustainable finance? Research, so far, has been able to establish trust with the global oligarchy. For instance, all central bankers of the world rely heavily, but not blindly, on research results. You cannot run a central bank without an ongoing stream of data, models, insights, mistakes, guesses, whatever. So there is a trust relation between research and the oligarchy, and this holds to some extent also to people like the people here who are interested in sustainability. But so far, neither the public debate nor the research have been able to produce inspiring and plausible ideas for how to go beyond a world where a not institutionally justified but real oligarchy struggles with problems that national governments are not able to deal with. I only tried to say a word, and I'll do it in 20 seconds, about what we as researchers can do, nothing more. We can try to maintain and deepen the level of trust and credibility that we have, and there's a lot of work to do, and at the same time, in parallel, work on research about how radical breakthroughs can happen technologically and institutionally. We are at the very beginning, but I take it this is the responsibility of most people in this room. It includes discussing with people like Thomas Jordan.
Thank you, Carlo. So let me try to summarize a couple of things that I take before we move into the slide of questions. So it seems that what is you guys have been stressing in particular is the fact that research is something that is and should also be, the importance of research should be better understood also by the private sector, in the sense that it allows for that kind of exploration that society needs to afford in order to take better pathways, and this is something that is going to be good also for the private actors. So nowadays we are actually facing because also the result of the last financial crisis, a kind of a vicious cycle in which research is increasingly cut, and governments are the shape of their budgets is increasingly bad, and this has negative consequences for research, but then this is then spiraling down. So that's something that needs to be definitely changed. But so for us, what we wanted to invite you to realize is how important and what is the scope of research that is at the frontier of fundamental investigation and applications. And so you can learn more. Also, if you go on our website, there are links to all of these projects that have been very briefly mentioned today. So let's turn to the question session. I'd like to pick maybe one or two from the slide, and then if there are urgent ones from the floor, please raise your hands. So maybe there is one that is actually for Giovanni. If you can compress it in a couple of minutes. Actually, I take the task of compressing two questions that seems related. One is whether social innovation is able to spur sustainable and inclusive growth, and I would pair that with financial innovation in a similar sense. So to what extent, is there a trade-off between social innovation and financial innovation and sustainable and inclusive growth?
I must confess that I don't know what social innovation is. We were looking at years and years ago in Sussex with the late Chris Freeman. There was a list of innovation compiled by Margaret Strait in 1949. And so you had a list of innovation from the fridge, the car, the zipper, National Socialism. What? National Socialism is a social innovation? I don't know. I mean, I think social innovation is a container to mean too many things. I mean, you have got institutional change, organizational change. Some are good, some are bad. Of course, the social innovation is, for example, breaking the back of the trade unions. This certainly is a social innovation. In my view, it's a bad one. So let's say institutional change. There can be institutional change that is good and other that is bad. I would urge everyone not to use generically social innovation, especially because when one says innovation, it's a connotation of being good. And sometimes it's bad. The same for financial innovation. If the introduction of more sophisticated instrument is a financial innovation, I would say that this is a weapon of mass destruction. And you should curb that. You should try to regulate and put limits to that type of financial innovation. I think we need to go back to simple, patient, long-term finance. I think now it has become becomes a social innovation because we have taken the other road toward very, very sophisticated instruments that are most often destabilizing.
Thank you, Giovanni. Among the panelists, I don't know if you were following the questions. Do you signal if you volunteer to pick any of the questions?
I'm just curious about the third question. Why it couldn't be Milan, for example? So, no.
Can I comment on this?
Which city will become the green finance center for Europe? London, Paris, Frankfurt, Zurich?
Can I say the answer? I know it.
Oh, please.
I know it because there's been historical research about how London survived the French Revolution, World War I, the Russian Revolution, World War II. London will survive Brexit. I'm very sorry. Whether the UK will survive is a completely different question, which is not of great interest to the City of London. Perhaps I leave it there, but I would also know the answer to some of the other questions. I have enough questions to which I don't know the answer, don't get me wrong. But on this one, I do know.
Any other question you stand that you, is any question that meet your fancy? While you,
At least
there is one for you actually.
I feel obliged to respond to this one. So, are you already?
Are there already developed frameworks to estimate the positive ecological impact for sustainable businesses, e.g. as an opposite of carbon footprint?
I'm not sure to fully understand the question, but I would say that there's, two aspects. One is the having something that is broader than carbon. So there's if you look at what's going on in the industrial sectors in terms of metrics, you do have research and existing metrics beyond carbon on I don't know, water pollution, air pollution, these type of things. One question I think where there's a big question mark is I think there's usually a huge confusion between the impact in the real economy of an activity and the impact of the finance sector by getting exposure to this activity. So if you take, for instance, green bonds, there's reporting from green bond issuers on what is the impact of the investment they make with the green bond. Does it mean that the investor who increase their exposure to green bond have any influence on what's taking place in the real economy? In most cases, the answer is no. Still, the investor will claim this as a kind of climate action or environmental action. And so I think where there's no framework today is to assess the impact of investors' action. So we have been discussing that a little bit this morning at the panel moderated by Max. There's no framework today to assess the impact of green instruments on the real economy. and the impact of these actions. Some of them, many actions of the investor are totally like neutral in terms of impacting the real economy. In certain cases, you could have impact indirect, but this is something where there's a need for the development of a framework, especially if governments want to introduce incentives.
Can you elaborate on that a second? Because you have a particular experience. You come from marketing. At the same time, your organization is engaging essentially in research. So it's something, you know, a little bit in between the practitioners and the research. So what kind of research is needed in order to clarify that question about the impact?
Okay, so I can give you an example where, okay, two examples. So we are actually developing this research together with the UNFCCC in the context of an ISO standard, the development of an ISO standard. So the idea, you have like today investor who start using their shareholder rights to influence the capital expenditure of company to shift investment toward climate goals. So there's like actually that was discussed in the one of the previous panel. So this is something where you can probably document the influence and how and what is the outcome in terms of changes of capital expenditure. So here there's probably like a way to build something. Obviously, it's very difficult to document the causality, but you can probably get somewhere. If you take this green bond market that will actually be on the top of the agenda of the Commission in terms of sustainable finance, today there's no evidence that the issuance of green bond lead to any changes in the capital expenditure of the company. They can perfectly issue bond to kind of refinance their business as usual activities. So here there's probably a need to develop an impact assessment framework, and likely the Commission will go in this direction as well. And to understand that, you need to understand if there is a premium paid to the issuer, to what extent, if there's a premium that appear on the market, is that big enough to influence the cost of capital for the issuer and potentially the investment decision. So that's the type of thing that will need to be documented and where a framework could be developed to assess the impact of the instrument.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the floor in addition to the slide? See one, the first one was the very back, if you can. Well, maybe while the microphone goes there, if you can have
thank you.
Second one. Please.
The panel spoke.
You have to speak up.
The panel spoke several times about how the global financial system, in face of that, nations often become powerless. So my question is there any room for any other nation than a human nation? A human nation. Is there room for any other than that?
Let's collect two questions. Maybe
So Mary Jean Buer, I'm very intrigued about the reporting that's been done, and I'm wondering about a sustainable business model reporting, and the sort of the transition towards not just, quantifying, CO2 emissions or water reduction or recycling or, some sort of indicator for the environmental impact or the green economy impact of a company or of a project or whatever compared to its baseline or that kind of thing, but rather really going one step beyond and talking about what is the business model, how has that business model transformed? If you take a company like Walmart or whatever, how have they transformed their business model? And then making investment decisions on that kind of information, which is not a quantifiable, specific metrics, right? And I'm wondering, the problem with some of there's all good intentions in all the sort of quantifiable metrics and so on, but there could be a lack of vision, beyond that. And I'm wondering what other kind of reporting initiatives can we encourage to allow companies to go beyond a lot of them are already, and including on green bonds. There's been some corporate green bonds where they're really transforming their entire supply chain. So what can we do to stimulate that? And I think that's about narrative and so on. I just wanted to hear your comments about that.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask you maybe to take one or to answer these questions if you like, and also to make a final, deliver a final message, take-home message that you'd like the people to deliver to people, to the audience today. Maybe shall we start from Carlo?
The questions that we don't know the answer to are huge, gigantic, and it's emotionally hard to live with them. It's easier to live with the illusion that you know the answers. We know some things, however, and it seems to me, not everybody may agree, that we don't have the institutions needed to solve the global problems, that the existing global financial system and structures like the UNFCCC will not be sufficient to address those challenges. But they are what we have. We should not first scrap them and hope for better later. So we have to learn stepwise. And it seems to me that it is plausible that we can switch globally from a brown growth path to a green growth path. Later growth will stop, but that will take a moment. And I see that efforts like yours and others are nudging relatively small parts of this gigantic thing we are living in that direction. Hopefully, while doing this, we'll also learn how to perhaps design, but certainly develop, institutional settings that will go beyond nation states, that will work even better than the European Union, if you allow the remark, and even better than the United Nations. But we cannot build them from scratch now. We have to learn in a haphazard way, and the insight that there are opportunities, like the success of renewables over the past decades, which is absolutely stunning, like changes in the way people eat, which is actually remarkable. I don't want to go deeply into it. So yes, there are elements for nudging this gigantic thing towards green growth, but we don't know a lot about it. And it's much better to try to be sober and, if you like, realistic, if you want to solve a really hard problem, which is what we have to do.
Thank you, Carlo. 1 minute per panelist, if you manage.
But 3 points. So first of all, no, just to reinforce your message, I think institutional innovation is a field for exploration, both by researchers and practitioners. That was a no-go a few years ago, talking about European research, while now there is a demand. And the relationship between public and private is just one of the fields. I think institutions goes really deeper into even pensions, public health. I mean, you can you can really play. Another priority is the value of non-financial values and their implications for financial values. This is clearly the top priority within public funders. They have the issues, they don't know how to handle this. And again, this is clearly a call to which researchers can respond. And finally, I have to make this, a bit more sophistication when we talk about the private sector, because the portfolio manager is not an entrepreneur. And within the private sector, we have all possible nuances and differences. I personally prefer not to talk about the public sector versus the private sector. For me, it's really about public interest and private interest that cut across sectors. And moreover, the recipe for the future is an alignment between the public and the private sectors, which is, by the way, the motto of my organization.
Well, condition to move forward, I'm not saying that this is the recipe to solve the problem. But condition to move forward, I think, is to change the boundary between market and non-market organizations, and market and non-market forms of governance. It was well known in the 50s, 60s, that there were many things that were too serious to be left to the market. And that included health, welfare, making wars. Now we are in a position in which we are wrapped in an ideology in which you have to justify why the public should intervene. And you have got to use the instrument that typically economists use, I mean, cost-benefit analysis. Why on earth, making cost-benefit analysis, you would have done the accelerator in CERN? If you'd asked economists to do a cost-benefit analysis, you would come up with no. Going to the moon, doing research on basic biology. I think that the public should regain space, and with that also the prevalence of politics upon interests, upon private interest. Then the means will talk about it, but this I think is a precondition.
Thank you. What can I say? Well, we're talking about crossing boundaries. There are other boundaries that this is my part, I would like you as a wrap-up message, take-home message. And these are between disciplines. No? These problems that we have just sketched about climate change, about sustainability, about the fact that we would like to have our sons to be alive, next generation. This is both a public and private interest, I would say. No? So this is something in which we can cooperate. It's a very complex problem because it sums up different effects from different actors. It has a non-linear behavior, it has a strange feedback. You do one thing and you see the opposite as a reaction. That's okay. I mean, you study theory of complex systems, so you know that you must expect these things. So very likely solution to this complex problem will come from efforts of different experts, mathematicians, economists, of course, people expert in financial market, why not physicists, and other people. So that's the take-home message.
Thank you. So I will trade my high-level conclusion to answer the questions. So I think on the question of new business model and assessment, so I agree with you that basically we cannot really address that with those quantitative metrics. I think actually in the field of like sustainability research, like financial research, there's ways to approach that, analyzing the evolution of sales by type of segment, the R&D, new models, this type of thing. What I noticed is that one thing where the financial sector struggle, we perform research on the models used by credit rating agencies. And what we discuss with them is, for instance, how do you distinguish a Kodak from a GE in terms of being able to adapt? And it's pretty critical because what they will really usually rate is the ability of a company to reimburse their debt in the next 3 to 5 years. But actually the maturity of the bonds can be way longer than that. And what they say in this case is like, yeah, we assess the adaptive capacity. But when we dig deeper, we figured out that they have no methodological framework to do that. So that's probably something that should be investigated. And the second question was about the human nation, and I don't have time anymore, so I would say, yes, we need a human nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. I'll take the opportunity to say, to give also my little take-home message. So, as you've seen, the range of aspects that have been raised here in the discussion, I'd like to add the fact that when it comes to investing, in particular when you invest in financial instruments, then typically these are, to some extent, a black box, because an investment, when you invest in a fund, that essentially it's an instrument that invests yet in a chain of other economic activities. Similarly, when you want to assess the impact of your investment, then you actually have to analyze the whole supply chain, and this is what Stan in the same metric has been leading very well. So very often, these lending chains or investment chains or supply chains get intertwined. And when they get intertwined, that's where network comes into place, and this is why we have this conference. So that's my take-home message. You need network models and network data in order to, it's one of the things that are needed definitely for sustainable finance. With that, I'd like to close an end, and before we thank the speakers, I'd like to say we need to leave the room very quickly, and don't leave anything inside, and take the ticket with you, and try and come back as soon as possible, so that we, sorry? Yeah, there is a coffee break downstairs. Sorry, I forgot to say, there is a coffee break, but don't indulge and come back. You have to come back, you have to be at the door by 4:45, 4:40.